Black boy gives seat to elderly woman. You won't believe the shocking note she give him. Jason slumped into the nearest empty seat as soon as he boarded the bus, his body heavy with exhaustion. His day had been particularly grueling. From the moment he woke up at 5 a.m. to his boss's cutting remarks echoing in his mind, he hadn't had a moment to breathe. The restaurant where he worked as a line cook was understaffed, and the pressure had fallen squarely on his shoulders. He could feel the tension in his neck and back, each muscle screaming from hours of standing, bending, and moving quickly in the hot, cramped kitchen. His uniform still carried the faint smell of grease, no matter how many times he washed it. Jason stared out of the bus window, trying to relax, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine and the blur of passing streetlights lull him into a daze. The bus was crowded, filled with the usual after-work crowd, tired faces, sagging bodies, people staring at their phones or lost in their thoughts. It was a scene Jason had come to know too well. He was used to this routine. Work, bus, home, repeat. And it wasn't just the restaurant. Jason had another job, an evening gig as a security guard. That job was less physically demanding, but no less exhausting. He'd sit for hours watching surveillance cameras, the monotony eating away at his energy just as much as the heat of the kitchen. He had dreams, of course, bigger ones. Dreams of a different kind of life, one where he didn't have to work two jobs just to get by, where he didn't have to deal with a toxic boss who seemed to thrive on belittling him. But those dreams felt far away, hazy, like a distant shore he could never quite reach. As he sat there, his eyelids grew heavy. He leaned back in his seat, trying to push away the thoughts of work and his endless to-do lists. But just as he began to drift into a half-conscious state, something caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, a small elderly woman with silver hair, hunched slightly, gripping the pole as the bus jerked forward. She wore a long coat despite the warmth of the day and carried a large worn handbag over her arm. Her face was soft with deep wrinkles, her eyes kind but weary, scanning the crowded bus for a place to sit. But there were no seats left. Jason glanced around, noticing that others saw her too but didn't move. Some people were too engrossed in their phones or too tired to care, while others avoided eye contact altogether, pretending not to see the old woman struggling to stand. Jason hesitated for a brief moment, considering his own exhaustion. His legs ached, his feet throbbed, and all he wanted was to stay seated until he reached his stop. But then he looked at her again, her frail hands gripping the pole, her thin frame swaying slightly with the movement of the bus. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just sit there. With a small sigh, Jason pushed himself up from his seat, his legs protesting as he did so. He gestured toward the empty spot, nodding to the elderly woman. "Here, ma'am. You can sit here," he said, his voice soft but clear enough to be heard over the dull roar of the bus. The woman's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. She smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to brighten her entire expression. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. She shuffled over slowly, taking his place with a relieved sigh as she sat down. Jason gave her a small nod before grabbing one of the overhead handrails to steady himself. The bus continued its bumpy journey through the city, the lights of passing cars and street lamps flickering through the windows. Jason stared ahead, lost in his thoughts again. The act had been small, barely significant to him, and in truth he didn't think much more about it. He just wanted to get through the ride, get home, and collapse into bed. But something else was about to happen. As Jason stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He turned to see the elderly woman looking up at him with a peculiar expression, as if she was deciding something important in that moment. "Young man," she began, her voice almost hesitant, "thank you again for your kindness. It's not often that people go out of their way to help someone anymore." Jason smiled politely. "It was nothing," he said, brushing it off. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer. Then, as if making a decision, she reached into her handbag. Jason watched as she pulled out a small piece of paper, folded neatly into a square. With a slight tremor in her hands, she extended it toward him. "Take this," she said, her eyes serious now. Jason looked at the paper, puzzled. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowing. The woman just smiled, a cryptic sort of smile that hinted at something more. "You'll understand soon enough," she said, placing the paper into his hand. Then, without another word, she turned away, settling into her seat as though nothing unusual had just occurred. Jason stared down at the paper, still confused. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the strange exchange. But everyone was engrossed in their own world. He slipped the note into his pocket, figuring he would look at it later. Maybe it was nothing, just a thank you or perhaps a phone number for someone offering some kind of service. He wasn't sure, but he was too tired to think much about it right now. The bus ride continued, uneventful, and before long, Jason's stop arrived. He exited the bus, still thinking about the long day ahead of him tomorrow and the endless cycle of work and exhaustion. When he got home, his apartment was quiet and dark. He flicked on the light, dropped his keys on the counter, and went about his usual routine, kicking off his shoes, changing out of his uniform, and collapsing onto the worn-out couch in the living room. His body ached, but his mind kept drifting back to the elderly woman on the bus. What had she meant by handing him that note? It was strange, the whole thing. Why would she give him anything? He had only offered her his seat. Jason sat up, curiosity getting the better of him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note, staring at it for a moment before slowly opening it. His eyes scanned the paper, and his heart skipped a beat. The note didn't contain a thank you or anything remotely expected. Instead, it held two things: an address and a strange code. He blinked, confused. An address? And what was this code supposed to be? Jason looked at the unfamiliar street name. He had no idea where it was or why this woman would give it to him. He considered the possibilities. Maybe it was a mistake. Perhaps she meant to give it to someone else, and he was just the wrong recipient. Or maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, though it didn't seem like the sort of thing an old lady on a bus would do. Still, there was something about the note that gnawed at him, a mystery that pulled at the edges of his tired mind. Jason couldn't shake the thought of the note as he lay in bed that night. He tossed and turned, replaying the moment in his mind. The way the elderly woman had slipped it into his hand, the cryptic look in her eyes as she insisted he take it. What had she meant when she said, "You'll understand soon enough"? Her words echoed in his head, swirling with the exhaustion of the day. The note seemed so out of place, so strange. Jason told himself to forget about it, that it was probably nothing. But deep down, a gnawing curiosity had already taken root. For the next few days, Jason tried to go about his life as usual. The hustle of juggling two jobs left little room for anything else. His routine was as grueling as ever. Early mornings in the kitchen, scrambling to keep up with orders while his boss barked orders from the corner, followed by long, quiet nights in front of the surveillance cameras at his security job. Each night, he would come home with his body worn out and his mind heavy, yet the note lingered in the back of his thoughts. On more than one occasion, Jason found himself reaching into his pocket, pulling out the small piece of paper, and staring at the address and code. He even considered throwing it away once or twice, convinced that it was some kind of misunderstanding. But every time he looked at it, the intrigue tugged at him a little harder. There was something about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, that made him hesitant to dismiss it. It wasn't until his next day off that Jason allowed himself the luxury of curiosity. He had been staring at the note for days now, wondering what would happen if he went to the address. The woman had seemed so deliberate, so intentional when she gave it to him. Surely it wasn't a mistake. But still, why him? Why now? That morning, Jason woke up with a strange sense of determination. His curiosity had reached its breaking point. He grabbed the note from his bedside table and stared at the address again. It was in a part of town he wasn't familiar with, somewhere far from his usual routes. He looked it up on his phone, feeling a strange knot in his stomach as he realized it wasn't just an ordinary residential area. The address led to an estate, a large, sprawling property on the outskirts of the city. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would an elderly woman, a stranger he had met on a bus, give him an address to a mansion? Jason wrestled with the decision for a few more minutes, pacing around his small apartment. Finally, he decided there was only one way to find out. He would go. He had nothing to lose after all. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe the woman needed help with something. The least he could do was check it out. After a quick shower and a change of clothes, Jason grabbed his keys and the note and headed out the door. The bus ride was long, taking him farther and farther away from the familiar parts of the city he had grown used to. As he looked out the window, the streets began to change. The tall apartment buildings gave way to quieter, more residential areas, with wide lawns and old trees lining the sidewalks. Eventually, the bus reached its last stop, and Jason found himself standing at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the estate not far from where he stood. He followed the directions on the note, walking down a narrow, tree-lined road that led him farther into the neighborhood until at last he arrived at the address. Jason stood in front of a large iron gate, peering through the bars at the massive estate beyond it. The house was old but grand, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and tall windows that reflected the sunlight. The grounds were immaculate, with perfectly trimmed hedges and flowers blooming along the pathways. It looked like something out of a movie, a place Jason would never imagine himself visiting. For a moment, Jason hesitated, his heart beating a little faster. He looked around, half expecting someone to pop out and tell him he was in the wrong place. But the street was empty, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. He glanced down at the note again, checking the code scrawled at the bottom. With a deep breath, he stepped up to the gate, finding a keypad just to the right. He entered the code, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed each number. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a soft click, the gate slowly swung open. Jason stepped through the gate, feeling like he was walking into another world. The estate was eerily quiet as he made his way up the long driveway, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. His mind raced with questions. Why had she given him this address? What was he supposed to find here? Each step seemed to pull him deeper into the mystery, his curiosity now fully consuming him. As he approached the front door, Jason took one last look around, half expecting someone to stop him. But no one did. The estate felt almost abandoned, its grandeur overshadowed by a quiet stillness that unsettled him. Gathering his courage, Jason knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing faintly in the distance. For a moment, there was no response. Jason shifted nervously, wondering if he should turn back. But just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open slowly. Standing there in the dim light of the entryway was the elderly woman from the bus. She looked just as he remembered, frail with her silver hair neatly pulled back and her kind eyes twinkling with the same mysterious glint. "You came," she said softly, her voice warm and welcoming. Jason stood there dumbfounded. He hadn't expected to see her again, let alone here, at this mansion. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to," he stammered, feeling suddenly out of place. The woman smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "I was hoping you would," she said simply, as if his arrival was the most natural thing in the world. Jason hesitated for a moment, but then he stepped inside. The house was even more impressive on the inside. The entry hall was grand, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that gave the space a timeless, almost regal feel. A large staircase spiraled upward, and ornate paintings hung on the walls, each one seemingly more expensive than the last. The woman led Jason down a long hallway, her steps slow and deliberate, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Jason's mind buzzed with questions, but he couldn't seem to find the right words to ask. Everything about the situation felt surreal, like he had stepped into a dream. At last, they reached a small sitting room at the back of the house, where the woman gestured for him to sit. Jason lowered himself into an armchair, feeling the weight of the moment settling over him. The woman took a seat across from him, her eyes soft but serious. "I'm sure you have many questions," she began, folding her hands in her lap, "and I will do my best to answer them. But first, I want to thank you again for your kindness. What you did that day on the bus may seem small to you, but it meant more to me than you could ever know." Jason shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "I just gave you my seat," he said, his voice uncertain. "It wasn't a big deal." The woman smiled, but there was something deeper in her expression now, something that hinted at the gravity of what was to come. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact. she said softly. And that day, your kindness set something in motion, something that brings us here now. Jason's confusion deepened. What do you mean? He asked, leaning forward slightly. The woman sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window for a moment before returning to him. I'm an old woman, Jason, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. And I won't be around much longer. I've lived a full life, but now I need someone I can trust. Someone who can help me in my final days. Jason blinked, surprised by the sudden turn in the conversation. You need help? He asked, still struggling to understand. She nodded. Yes, I need a caretaker. Someone who can be here for me, to help with the little things, and to ensure that I'm not alone as my health declines. She paused, her eyes searching his face. I've been watching you, Jason. Not in a way that should make you uncomfortable, but I've seen the way you carry yourself. You're hardworking, compassionate, and most importantly, you have a good heart. That's why I chose you. Jason sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. This was far more than he had ever expected. He had thought the note might lead to some simple explanation, but this was something entirely different. Jason sat in stunned silence, struggling to process everything the elderly woman had just told him. The grandeur of the estate around him, the strange circumstances that had led him to this moment. It all felt like a dream, one he couldn't quite grasp. Why him? Why had she chosen him of all people? He could barely manage to take care of himself, let alone someone else. As if sensing his unease, the woman leaned forward slightly, her frail hands resting on her knees. I know this must be overwhelming, she said softly, and I don't expect you to give me an answer right away. But I do want you to think about it. I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe you were capable. Jason swallowed hard, still not entirely sure what to say. But I don't even know you, he finally blurted out. You don't know me either. Why would you trust a stranger to take care of you? The woman smiled gently, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You're not a stranger, Jason. Not anymore. You may not know me yet, but I've learned a lot about you in the short time we've met. You have a good soul, and that's what matters to me. In my life, I've learned that the people who care, who truly care, are rare, and I believe you're one of them. Jason's chest tightened at her words. He had never thought of himself in those terms. He wasn't used to being seen that way. Kind, caring. He was just doing what he thought was right, trying to get by like everyone else. He looked down at his hands, calloused from long hours in the kitchen, and felt the weight of her gaze on him, as if she could see something in him he had never been able to see in himself. I don't know, he muttered, shaking his head. I mean, I've never taken care of anyone before. I wouldn't even know where to start. The woman reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm despite her frail appearance. That's okay, she said. You don't have to have all the answers right now. I'll guide you through it, and you'll learn. What matters is that you're willing to try. Jason looked up at her, still feeling the pull of doubt and uncertainty. But there was something about her, something in the way she spoke, in the kindness and vulnerability in her eyes, that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could do this. He wasn't sure why she had chosen him, but he didn't feel like he could walk away from her either. She seemed so alone, so in need of someone to be there for her in her final days. Okay, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I'll think about it. The woman smiled, her face lighting up with gratitude. That's all I ask. She rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate and careful, and gestured for Jason to follow her. There's something I want to show you, she said, her voice soft but insistent. Jason stood and followed her out of the sitting room and back down the long hallway. As they walked, the grandeur of the house seemed to close in around him. The high ceilings, the antique furniture, the paintings that lined the walls, each one a testament to a life lived in a different era. It was as though the house itself held countless stories, secrets hidden behind every door. They reached the back of the house where a set of large glass doors opened onto a sprawling garden. The woman led him outside, her pace slow but steady as they walked down a stone path that went through the meticulously maintained flower beds and hedges. Jason couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the place. The garden was lush and vibrant, the air filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the bustling city just beyond the estate's gates, a serene oasis hidden away from the world. As they walked deeper into the garden, Jason noticed a small, secluded area off to the side. A simple stone bench sat beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, and nearby, a large bronze statue stood at the center of a circular clearing. The statue depicted a young man, his hands outstretched as if reaching for something just out of his grasp. Jason stared at the statue, a sense of quiet reverence settling over him. "This was my husband's favorite plate," the woman said quietly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He passed away many years ago, but I come here often to remember him." Jason turned to look at her, seeing the sadness in her eyes as she gazed at the statue. He could feel the weight of her loss, the loneliness that had settled into her life after so many years of living without him. "I don't want to spend my last days alone," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived a long life, but there are moments, especially lately, when the solitude feels unbearable. That's why I need someone like you, Jason. Someone who can help me, yes, but more than that, someone who can be there." Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her words. He had never really thought about what it would be like to grow old and face the end of life alone. The idea of being in her shoes, of living in this grand house, surrounded by memories but with no one to share them with, filled him with an unexpected sense of sadness. He realized then that her request wasn't just about practical help. It was about companionship. She didn't want to leave this world without someone by her side. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the rustling of the leaves above them. Jason's mind raced, torn between the life he knew, the struggle of working 2 jobs, the constant grind to make ends meet, and this new possibility. He couldn't deny that there was something deeply moving about her offer, something that spoke to a part of him he hadn't known existed. The idea of being there for her, of helping her in her final days, felt like a kind of purpose, a chance to do something meaningful. But there were still so many questions. What would this new role require of him? How would he balance it with his current life? And perhaps most daunting of all, what would it be like to watch someone he had grown close to face the end? The woman seemed to sense his internal struggle. She placed a hand on his arm again, her touch gentle and reassuring. "I don't expect you to make a decision today," she said. "Take your time. Think about it. You're young, and you have your whole life ahead of you. I know this is a big responsibility, and I wouldn't want you to feel pressured. But if you choose to help me, know that I will do everything I can to make sure you're taken care of as well." Jason nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'll need some time to figure things out," he admitted, his voice low. "Of course," she said with a kind smile. "You're welcome to come by whenever you want. The door will always be open to you." They walked back to the house together, the air between them filled with a quiet understanding. Jason's mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, but there was also a strange sense of calm settling over him, as if some part of him had already made the decision, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. When they reached the front door, the woman turned to him one last time. "Thank you for coming, Jason," she said. "Whatever you decide, I'm grateful that you took the time to listen." Jason smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. "I'll let you know soon." With that, he stepped outside and made his way back down the driveway, the heavy iron gates closing behind him with a soft clang. As he walked back toward the bus stop, Jason felt the full weight of the decision ahead of him. His life had been so focused on survival for so long, on just getting by day to day. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he had been given a chance to do something different, something that might actually matter in a way that went beyond paying the bills. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the lonely life she had led in that massive house. Her vulnerability, her quiet dignity. It all stirred something deep inside him, something that made him feel like maybe this was the right path. But it also terrified him. He had never been responsible for anyone else before, never faced the kind of emotional and physical challenges that this role might bring. As the bus approached and Jason climbed aboard, he sat down in one of the empty seats, staring out the window as the city streets passed by in a blur. The world around him felt both familiar and entirely different now. He had been given a choice, one that could change the course of his life. And for the first time in a long time, Jason found himself wondering what kind of life he truly wanted. Jason took a few days to mull over the decision. Each time he thought about it, a different wave of emotion washed over him: uncertainty, curiosity, fear, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The magnitude of what was being asked of him weighed heavily on his mind. But so did the loneliness he had seen in the old woman's eyes. It was a look he couldn't shake, something that tugged at his conscience every time he tried to move on with his routine life. At work, he found himself more distracted than usual. The clanging of pots and pans in the kitchen blended into a distant hum as he stood at his station, absently stirring a pot of sauce. His boss yelled something from across the kitchen, snapping him out of his thoughts, but the distraction remained in the back of his mind. Even the monotony of his second job as a security guard couldn't quiet the internal debate he was having. The cameras flickered, the same empty corridors looping on screen, but Jason's thoughts were far away, focused on a sprawling estate and a mysterious old woman. On his next day off, Jason decided to return to the mansion. He hadn't called ahead or made any formal commitment, but there was a feeling inside him that urged him to go, a sense that maybe this was what he was meant to do. The thought of starting something new, a job that, despite its challenges, had the potential to be different, meaningful, was growing stronger. When he arrived at the estate, he felt the same sense of awe that had struck him on his first visit. The grandeur of the place, the quiet that hung over it like a protective veil, made it seem almost otherworldly. The iron gates opened with a familiar soft click as he entered the code, and he walked up the long driveway, the path now slightly more familiar, but still filled with an underlying tension. As he reached the front door, it opened before he could knock. The woman stood there, a small smile on her face, as if she had been expecting him all along. Her eyes softened when she saw him, a quiet relief settling in their depths. "I'm glad you came back," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. Jason entered, feeling a strange sense of belonging he hadn't anticipated. The house was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt eerie. Instead, it felt peaceful, welcoming even. He followed her into the same sitting room where they had spoken the last time, and as they settled into the chairs, Jason felt the weight of his decision begin to lift, just a little. "I've thought a lot about what you said," he began, his voice careful as he searched for the right words. "And I think I'd like to help, if you'll still have me." The woman's smile deepened, her eyes crinkling at the corners with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Jason. You don't know how much this means to me." And so it began. The first few days of Jason's new role were simple, almost uneventful. He helped with small tasks around the house, preparing meals, keeping her company, and assisting with light housekeeping. The work itself wasn't difficult, but it was the emotional weight of it that Jason felt most keenly. He was now a part of this woman's life, sharing in her daily routine, becoming her companion in a way that felt both intimate and strange. Her name was Eleanor, he learned, Eleanor Harper. She had been widowed for nearly 20 years, and her health had been slowly declining over the last decade. She had no children, no close family, and her friends, the few who were still alive, were scattered across the country. Her life had become increasingly isolated, her days spent alone in the vast mansion, surrounded by the memories of a life she had once shared with her husband. As the days passed, Jason began to settle into his new routine. He still kept his evening job as a security guard, but his time at the estate became the focus of his day. Eleanor's needs were modest at first, and much of their time was spent simply talking. They would sit together in the garden, beneath the shade of the old oak tree, or by the large bay windows in the sitting room, watching the sunlight dance across the floor. She would tell him stories of her younger days, her travels with her husband, the adventures they had shared, the love that had defined her life. Jason listened, sometimes in awe of the richness of her experiences, other times saddened by the deep sense of loss that lingered beneath her words. In return, Eleanor seemed genuinely interested in Jason's life. She asked him about his jobs, his upbringing, his hopes for the future. Jason found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about the struggles he had faced growing up, about his dream of going to school one day, about how he had been working 2 jobs just to stay afloat. It was strange, he thought, to be sitting in a mansion talking about financial hardship. But Eleanor never made him feel out of place. Instead, she listened with a quiet empathy that made him feel understood in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. As their bond deepened, Jason began to notice the little things. How Eleanor's strength seemed to ebb and flow with each passing day, how the brightness in her eyes would sometimes fade, leaving her looking fragile and tired. Some days she was full of energy, eager to talk, to walk through the garden, to share more stories. Other days she could barely muster the strength to leave her bedroom, and Jason would sit quietly by her side, keeping her company as she rested. One evening, as Jason was preparing dinner, Eleanor asked him to sit with her in the dining room instead of in the kitchen. It was a small request, but it felt significant. The dining room, with its long, polished table and antique china cabinet, had an air of formality that made Jason feel slightly out of place, but Eleanor wanted to share a meal with him, as if they were old friends rather than caretaker and employer. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Then, without warning, Eleanor broke the quiet. "You've been good to me, Jason," she said softly, her eyes fixed on her plate. "More than I could have ever asked for." Jason looked up, surprised by the sudden seriousness in her tone. "I'm just doing what I can," he replied, unsure how to respond. Eleanor's gaze lifted to meet his, her expression filled with a quiet intensity. "No, it's more than that. You've given me something I didn't expect. Companionship. I thought these last few months would be the loneliest of my life, but you've made them bearable. For that, I am grateful." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much his presence had meant to her. It had been easy to think of his role as just a job, but in that moment, he understood that it was so much more than that. He wasn't just helping her with practical tasks. He was giving her a sense of connection, of human warmth in a life that had grown cold with isolation. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's health continued to decline, and Jason's responsibilities grew. He learned how to help her with more intimate tasks, bathing, dressing, administering her medication. It wasn't easy, and there were times when Jason felt out of his depth, unsure if he was doing things right. But Eleanor's gentle encouragement and patience guided him through it. She never made him feel inadequate, even when he fumbled, even when he was clearly learning on the job. There were moments of quiet beauty too, small, fleeting moments that Jason would later come to treasure. Like the afternoons when they would sit in the garden and Eleanor would close her eyes, a peaceful smile on her face as the sunlight warmed her skin. Or the nights when Jason would read to her from one of her old books, his voice steady as Eleanor drifted off to sleep. But there were also moments of fear. Eleanor's health wasn't just deteriorating, it was slipping away, and Jason could see it happening, day by day. One evening, he found her collapsed on the floor in her bedroom, too weak to stand. He had rushed to her side, his heart pounding with panic as he helped her into bed. That night, Jason stayed by her side, watching over her as she slept fitfully, the reality of her condition sinking in deeper than ever before. Despite the challenges, Jason found himself growing more attached to Eleanor. She had become more than just someone he worked for. She was like family to him now, a figure who had somehow filled a space in his life he hadn't known was empty. Their connection was unspoken but undeniable, and Jason found himself dreading the inevitable moment when he would have to say goodbye. Then one quiet afternoon, something unexpected happened. Eleanor asked Jason to sit with her in the library, a room filled with dusty books and old photographs, relics of her past. She was sitting in an armchair by the window, her hands trembling slightly as she held an envelope in her lap. Jason could sense that something important was about to be said, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. "I've made arrangements," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I'm gone, you won't have to worry about anything. You'll be taken care of." Jason's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes met his, a mixture of sadness and resolve in them. "I've left everything to you, Jason. The house, the investments, everything. It's all in my will." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. "You? You're leaving everything to me?" he stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You've given me more than anyone else ever could, Jason. You've been my companion, my caretaker, my friend. I want to make sure that when I'm gone, you have the chance to live the life you've always dreamed of." Jason sat there stunned into silence. He had never imagined something like this. It felt surreal, like a dream he wasn't sure he deserved. But as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he realized that this was her final gift to him, a way to repay him for the kindness and care he had shown her. It wasn't about the money or the house. It was about the connection they had shared, the bond they had formed. And in that moment, Jason understood just how much he had meant to her. The days passed in a blur after Eleanor's revelation. Jason found himself grappling with the magnitude of what she had just told him. It wasn't just the inheritance, though that alone would have been overwhelming. It was the sheer weight of the gesture, the significance of what she had entrusted him with. She had given him not just material wealth, but something deeper, her trust, her final wishes, her legacy. Jason didn't bring up the subject again, even though it lingered in the back of his mind constantly. He wasn't sure what to say, how to thank her, or if he even deserved such an incredible gift. Every day he spent with Eleanor now felt heavier, imbued with the knowledge that their time together was coming to an end. She was growing weaker, her energy fading more quickly than before. Her vibrant spirit, which had shone through even in her frail moments, was dimming, and Jason knew it. One evening after a particularly difficult day when Eleanor had barely been able to leave her bed, Jason was sitting in the living room, trying to process it all. The house felt different now, quieter, darker, as if it too was preparing for her departure. The wind outside whistled through the old windows, and the shadows from the flickering fireplace danced across the walls. Jason sat on the edge of the couch, staring into the flames, lost in thought. Suddenly he heard a noise, a faint creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floor above. Jason's heart quickened. Eleanor was supposed to be asleep, but the sound didn't seem like her light steps. It was heavier, deliberate, like someone moving through the house with purpose. He stood up, his body tense with unease, and listened closely. The footsteps were closer now, moving toward the stairs. Without thinking, Jason moved toward the entryway, where the grand staircase descended into the foyer. He barely had time to react before he saw the figure. A man, tall and bulky, dressed in dark clothing, creeping down the stairs. Jason's blood ran cold. An intruder. For a split second, Jason froze, his mind racing. What was this man doing here? How had he gotten in? But there was no time to think. His first instinct was to protect Eleanor. Whoever this man was, he couldn't let him get to her. Without hesitating, Jason rushed toward the intruder, catching him off guard. The man turned, his face partially obscured by the shadow, but his eyes flashed with surprise. Before Jason could fully comprehend what was happening, the man lunged at him, his arms swinging wildly. Jason ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the blow, but the force of the man's movement knocked him off balance. They grappled in the dimly lit foyer, their movements clumsy and frantic. Jason wasn't a fighter. He'd never been in a real confrontation like this before. But adrenaline surged through his veins, and all he could think about was Eleanor. The man was stronger, more experienced, but Jason's determination made up for his lack of skill. He dodged another punch and threw himself at the intruder, tackling him to the ground with all the strength he could muster. The man struggled beneath him, but Jason held on, refusing to let go. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how much was at stake. The fight seemed to go on forever, but in reality it was only a matter of minutes before Jason managed to pin the man down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The intruder cursed under his breath, thrashing beneath Jason's grip, but he couldn't break free. Just as Jason was about to call out for help, he heard another sound, soft footsteps coming down the stairs. His heart lurched in his chest. Eleanor. She appeared at the top of the staircase, her frail figure illuminated by the dim light. She looked more fragile than ever, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were wide with shock as she took in the scene below. Jason's mind raced. He didn't want her to see this, to be frightened or distressed, but it was too late. Jason! Eleanor's voice was a raspy whisper, filled with fear and concern. She began to descend the stairs, her steps slow and shaky. "Stay back, Eleanor!" Jason shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He didn't want her anywhere near the danger, but Eleanor kept moving, her determination palpable despite her frailty. The intruder, sensing that the situation was slipping out of his control, made one final attempt to break free. He twisted beneath Jason's hold, throwing his weight to the side in a desperate bid for escape. Jason lost his grip for a moment, just long enough for the man to shove him away. Jason stumbled, falling back onto the floor, pain shooting through his side as he landed hard. Before Jason could get up, the man was on his feet, darting toward the front door. He hesitated for only a second, casting one last glance at Eleanor before he threw open the door and disappeared into the night. Jason struggled to his feet, his body aching from the confrontation, but his thoughts were entirely on Eleanor. He turned to her, his heart pounding with fear. She was still standing at the base of the stairs, but her face had gone white, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Eleanor," Jason said, rushing to her side. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond right away. Her breathing was shallow, and she clutched her chest, her hand trembling. Jason's heart sank. This had been too much for her. I'm fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But Jason could see that she wasn't fine at all. He gently guided her back up the stairs and into her bedroom, his mind racing with worry. She sank onto the bed, her body weak and unsteady, and Jason quickly fetched her medication. As she lay back against the pillows, her breathing still shallow, Jason sat by her side, his hands shaking as he poured her a glass of water. For the next few hours, Jason stayed by her bedside, watching her closely, terrified that her health would take a sudden turn for the worse. The adrenaline from the fight had long worn off, replaced by a deep sense of dread. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not like this. By the time the sun began to rise, Eleanor had stabilized, but Jason could see that the night's events had taken a toll on her. She was weaker than she had been before, her energy drained from the ordeal. She looked at Jason with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as if she knew something he didn't. "Jason," she said softly, her voice raspy but steady. "I'm so sorry." Jason frowned, confused. "Sorry? For what? None of this was your fault." Eleanor shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I've put you in danger. I never wanted that." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. "You didn't put me in danger, Eleanor. That man, and whoever he was, he's gone now. You're safe. That's all that matters." But Eleanor didn't seem reassured. She reached out and took Jason's hand in hers, her grip weak but steady. "I'm not safe," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Jason didn't understand what she meant, but before he could ask, Eleanor closed her eyes, her body sinking deeper into the bed. She was exhausted, her strength nearly gone, and Jason knew she needed rest. He stayed by her side, his hand still holding hers as she drifted off to sleep. Over the next few days, Eleanor's health continued to decline. Jason did everything he could to care for her, but it was clear that she was slipping away. The life she had once lived, full of adventure and love, was fading with her, and all Jason could do was be there for her in her final days. One morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Jason sat by Eleanor's bedside, watching her breathing grow shallow and uneven. She hadn't spoken in hours, her body too weak to muster the energy, but her eyes fluttered open one last time. She looked at Jason, her gaze soft and filled with an unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason's heart clenched. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to find the words to respond. All he could do was nod, his eyes filled with tears. A few moments later, Eleanor's breathing slowed, and then, with one final breath, she was gone. Jason sat there in the quiet stillness of the room, his hands still holding hers, as the weight of her loss settled over him. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness that followed. Eleanor, the woman who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined, was gone. The days that followed were a blur of grief and paperwork. Eleanor's attorney contacted Jason soon after her passing, confirming what she had told him, that she had left everything to him, the mansion, the investments, the estate. It was all his now. Jason felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all, but the material wealth didn't matter to him. What mattered was the time he had spent with Eleanor, the bond they had shared, and the lessons she had taught him about kindness, compassion, and the importance of human connection. As Jason stood outside the mansion one last time, looking up at the grand house that had once seemed so intimidating, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Eleanor had given him more than just a house or money. She had given him a new perspective on life, a chance to start over, and the understanding that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life forever. And as he walked away from the mansion, his heart heavy but full, Jason knew that he would carry Eleanor's memory with him for the rest of his life. The day of Eleanor's funeral was a somber one. Jason stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching as a small group of mourners gathered around her grave. Most of them were distant acquaintances, people from her past whom Jason had never met. He had expected more people, but as he stood there, it struck him just how lonely her final years had been. Eleanor had outlived most of the people who had meant the most to her, and now the few who remained were scattered and distant. It made Jason's heart ache to think of it, how someone who had lived such a full life could leave the world with so few to mourn her passing. As the priest delivered the final rites, Jason's mind wandered back to the time he had spent with her, remembering their conversations, her stories, the way she had looked at him, with that knowing smile, always so gentle and kind. It was hard to believe she was gone. In the weeks leading up to her death, he had tried to prepare himself for this moment. But now that it was here, the grief hit him harder than he had expected. When the ceremony ended, the few mourners drifted away, leaving Jason alone at the grave. He stood there for a long time, staring at the fresh mound of earth, the small headstone etched with her name. It was a simple marker, understated, just like Eleanor had been in her later years. Jason felt a lump rise in his throat, and for the first time since her passing, he allowed himself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves as the weight of everything he had experienced over the past few months finally caught up with him. He wasn't just grieving Eleanor's death. He was mourning the end of something much larger, the quiet companionship they had shared, the unexpected friendship that had blossomed between them. She had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, and now that she was gone, he felt a profound emptiness. But alongside the sorrow was something else, something he couldn't quite name, an odd sense of peace. He had been there for her in her final moments, and somehow, that felt like enough. He had done what he could, and now he had to move forward. In the days that followed, Jason threw himself into the practical tasks that came with inheriting an estate. The lawyer handling Eleanor's will was meticulous, walking him through each step of the process. At first, it was all too much for Jason to take in. The sheer scale of what she had left him was staggering. Not only had she willed him the mansion and the surrounding property, but she had also left him a substantial sum of money, investments, and assets he hadn't even known existed. It was more wealth than Jason could have ever imagined, far beyond anything he had ever dreamed of having. He spent hours in meetings with accountants and financial advisors, trying to understand how best to manage his newfound fortune. It felt surreal sitting in those meetings, dressed in the same clothes he had worn when he was struggling to make ends meet, listening to people talk about stocks and bonds and estate taxes. Jason had always been careful with money, stretching his paychecks as far as they could go, and now suddenly he had more than enough to last a lifetime. It was overwhelming, but it was also liberating in a way he hadn't expected. Despite the enormity of the inheritance, Jason didn't feel like a different person. He still woke up early every morning, still made his own breakfast, still went for walks through the city to clear his head. But there was a newfound sense of possibility, a weight that had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't have to worry about how he would pay the rent, how he would make it through the next month. He had choices now, real choices, and that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. One of the first things Jason did was quit his second job as a security guard. It wasn't an impulsive decision. He had thought about it for days, weighing the pros and cons. The job had provided stability for him when he needed it most. But now with Eleanor's inheritance, he realized he didn't have to grind himself into exhaustion anymore. He could finally breathe, finally take some time to figure out what he really wanted to do with his life. It wasn't easy letting go of that routine. Jason had spent so long in survival mode, constantly working, constantly pushing himself just to get by, that it felt strange to have free time, to not be constantly exhausted. But as the days passed, he began to embrace the change. He started spending more time at the mansion, taking care of the house and the garden, which had become a source of comfort for him. The garden, with its winding paths and vibrant flowers, reminded him of the quiet moments he had shared with Eleanor, and being there made him feel closer to her. As Jason settled into his new life, he began to reflect on what Eleanor had left him, not just the material wealth, but the lessons she had imparted through her actions and their conversations. Eleanor had lived a life full of love and adventure, but in her final years she had shown Jason the importance of kindness, the power of connection, and the value of living a life with purpose. These lessons stayed with him, guiding him as he began to think about what he wanted to do next. One evening, as Jason sat in the library, flipping through one of Eleanor's old travel journals, an idea began to form in his mind. Eleanor had traveled the world with her husband, seeking out new experiences and living life to the fullest. Jason, on the other hand, had spent most of his life in the same city, trapped in a cycle of work and struggle. For the first time, he realized that he didn't have to live that way anymore. He had the means, the freedom, and the opportunity to explore the world, to see the places Eleanor had described so vividly in her journals. The thought of traveling excited him, but it also felt daunting. Jason had never been much of a risk-taker, never one to venture too far outside his comfort zone. But now, with Eleanor's legacy behind him, he felt a new sense of courage. He decided that he would honor her memory by following in her footsteps, by traveling, by experiencing the world the way she had, by living his life with the same sense of adventure she had once embraced. In the months that followed, Jason began planning his first trip. He spent hours researching destinations, reading about different cultures, and dreaming about the places he would go. He didn't have a set itinerary. He wanted the freedom to explore, to go where his heart led him. It felt like the start of something new, something big. And as he stood on the brink of this new chapter in his life, Jason felt a sense of excitement and possibility that he hadn't felt in years. But even as he planned his travels, Jason knew that Eleanor's memory would always be with him. She had changed his life in ways he could never have anticipated, and the lessons she had taught him would continue to guide him as he moved forward. Her kindness, her generosity, her belief in him, it had all shaped him into the person he was becoming, and he would carry that with him wherever he went. As he packed his bags for the first leg of his journey, Jason couldn't help but think back to that moment on the bus when he had offered his seat to a frail old woman, never knowing how much that small act of kindness would change his life. It had been such a simple gesture, something he hadn't thought twice about at the time. But now, standing in his grand home, preparing to embark on a new adventure, Jason realized that it was that very moment, that small, seemingly insignificant act, that had set everything in motion. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or the mansion or the inheritance that mattered most to Jason. It was the reminder that life is full of unexpected twists and turns, that kindness can ripple out in ways we can't predict, and that sometimes the smallest acts of generosity can lead to the most profound changes. Eleanor had taught him that, and now, as he prepared to set off into the world, Jason was determined to carry that lesson with him, to live his life with kindness, with purpose, and with the understanding that even the simplest actions can make all the difference. Jason closed his suitcase and stood by the door, taking one last look around the mansion that had once felt so foreign but now felt like home. He knew that wherever he went, whatever new experiences lay ahead, Eleanor would always be a part of him, her memory woven into the fabric of his life. And as he stepped out into the world, ready to embrace whatever came next, Jason smiled, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be.